Russia warns the United States against supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles, saying such a decision by Washington would, quote, cross a red line. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said any such move by the US would make it a party to the conflict. She stressed that Moscow reserves the right to defend its territory. The US has supplied Ukraine with advanced rockets fired from HIMARS launchers. Washington says Kiev has promised not to use them to strike Russian territories. In the meantime, the United States is preparing to send Ukraine another package of military assistance. The United States and its Western allies have delivered large quantities of weapons to Kiev to help it fight with Russia. Moscow has time and again accused the West and the US in particular of fanning the flame of war by arming Ukraine. Well, let's dig a little deeper. I have two guests joining me in this news review. Judith Bello, senior member of the United National Anti-War Movement from Rochester, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Thanks to the both of you for joining us. Tony, thank you very much for joining us. Judith thinks that the US wants to take the war into Russia and onto Russian territory in order to prolong the war. Do you think this is why the West is ignoring intentionally the warnings of Russia for fueling the war with arms and basically prolonging the war?
Well, look, here in the West, we have intense censorship and propaganda. So, years ago, we used to hear about how terrible it was that China had an internet firewall. Now we have an internet firewall. We are not allowed in England, in Britain, and in Europe, and in the United States to look at much of the content which is being, the news which is coming out of Russia. And so we're not allowed to see the Russian point of view of these things. And so that is obviously a pre-World War propaganda, media, but psychological warfare operation going on there. But look, what are these missiles that the United States has been supplying since August into this conflict? It should be obvious to your viewers that the Ukrainians may be pressing the buttons to fire these rockets. 50 miles is their range, roughly, the HIMARS, but the intelligence as to where to fire them at is coming via US satellites, NATO satellites, and the NATO intelligence. So this is really a NATO war where they have mercenaries and they have the Ukrainian army sitting on the ground pressing buttons for them. And the obvious reaction from the Russians to something like the introduction of these 50-mile range, well, they're called rockets. It's called the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, the HIMARS, but actually they're not rockets. These warheads, they have the M30A1 warheads, 6 on each of these vehicles. They actually do have GPS tracking and the inertial guidance systems, some of them. In fact, they are basically missiles. They're not rockets at all. So a rocket is something that doesn't have guidance. These do. And if you remember a year ago in Afghanistan, one of these was fired by the United States and it killed 20 innocent civilians. They are very dangerous pieces of equipment. And the obvious ploy from the Russian point of view is to make sure that they intensify the fighting in order to push all of these Ukrainian troops and create a buffer zone of at least 50 miles with the Russian border. Well, they've pretty much done that anyway, and so they will have to go even further. By the way, this is what the West is doing to fuel the flames, is $100,000 plus per missile. So every time they fire one of these things, or 6 of them, it's over $500,000 per attack. So the arms business is making lots of money out of this, and the British, the American taxpayers, etc., are paying the bill for this carnage. So it's quite understandable that the Russians are saying this is crossing the red line. The original invasion back in, well, I still call it an invasion, back in February this year, was triggered by the threat by Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, that he wanted to get nuclear weapons. Well, are the West going to supply him all sorts of more advanced weapons, including potentially nuclear weapons? This is the sort of thing that the Russians were understandably nervous about. And so the West is simply, and NATO is simply fueling the flames it is actually running a proxy war here, which could easily turn into a third world war, never mind what's going on in the Pacific.
Exactly. Judith, over back to you. Russia says it reserves the right to defend its territory if it were attacked. Will supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine lead to a direct confrontation between the Russian and American forces in Europe? What do you think?
Well, I think that the United States really does not want a direct confrontation with Russia. At the same time, with the Iranians as our intermediary, or the Ukrainians, I should say, as our intermediary, it's not clear what they might or might not do. So hopefully the U.S. has them on a fairly tight rein in terms of invading Russia, because if they were to invade Russia, if not a U.S. war, it would certainly be a NATO war. Given that Russia was putting out offers that were reasonably fair and that were close to a return to the status quo with, the Minsk agreement being enforced. But instead, the United States is making absolutely certain that there will be no negotiation. And if there won't be any negotiation, then we can't be sure of what will happen.
Absolutely. Going back to you, Tony, the war in Ukraine has led to profound economic crisis in many European countries. How long do you think the Europeans will be able to withstand the crisis and continue supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia?
Well, let me let you into a little secret, because ever since the end of the Second World War, the United States and their intelligence service, the Central Intelligence Agency, which was set up not long after the Second World War, has been pouring hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars into keeping the Russians and the Europeans away from each other, and also to create this alienation. So I don't think that the Americans have done this for nothing. They always wanted to have a war with Russia, and of course this actually does suit the United States. If people are dying in Europe, they don't really mind. They would like to see pressure put on Russia in a place which is not going to affect mainland United States and just affect the Europeans. I think it was the former Marine Corps intelligence officer and weapons inspector Scott Ritter that said, with all due respect to Europeans, you're pathetic. And what's happened is that Europe has been absolutely pathetic in simply doing what the United States has wanted it to do, what NATO has wanted it to do, without any pushback at all, with people like Ursula von der Leyen and Boris Johnson, and now, of course, Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister here in Britain, simply just reading a script written from the Pentagon, written by Washington. And that is why I don't think we're going to see. And yet, one thing I would say with the Americans are doing to jeopardize the lives of ordinary Ukrainians is what will now begin to happen is the Russians will be using their satellites and their drones to interdict the shipments of these HIMARS missiles and the HIMARS vehicles as they come into Ukraine, in the west of Ukraine, however they come in by rail, by road, maybe disguised as food lorries. These will start to be attacked. And so many civilians will be being killed as the Russians attempt to take out these missiles as they're coming into the country via Europe. And that, of course, is going to lead to more civilian deaths and more innocent people dying in Ukraine because the Americans don't care about those people. They just really want to needle Russia. Let me also point out that I think the main impetus behind this conflict is one of two different ideologies, as spelt out by the excellent economist Michael Hudson. You've got the mixed economies and the industrial capitalism of the East, that is China, Russia, and many other countries around the world. And now you've got this ubiquitous finance capitalism, which says that money can buy governments, buy the press, and that is what's the NATO. That's the philosophy of the NATO countries, and that is why they have tried to wage this economic war on Russia and completely failed. Yesterday, in the Sun newspaper, the most popular newspaper here in Britain, we had a fascinating graphic on how much the food prices have been going down in Russia and how much the food prices have been going up in the West. and in Britain particularly. So we are suffering because of the sanctions policy. We have elderly people going hungry. We have people who are having to go to food banks and beg for food here, whilst the Russian public are rubbing their hands and they're saying, well, actually, that's great. We're paying something like 30% less for our potatoes now. And so the economic warfare is completely backfired, and the Western leadership is completely incompetent, actually the Europeans particularly, because they have simply done what the United States wants, and they're basically resuming the Cold War for the benefit of Washington and the Pentagon. So it's pretty pathetic what the Europeans have done, and of course many more Ukrainians are going to be, innocent Ukrainians are going to be dying as a result of this. And of course there are many Ukrainians that don't want to fight this war at all. They realise, just as many millions of other people do, that it's just a proxy war for the United States against Putin.
Absolutely, very interesting to see how things will plan out. Thanks to the both of you for sharing your insights. Judith Bello, senior member from the United National Anti-War Movement from Rochester. And Tony Gosling from Bristol. Thanks to the both of you for joining us. Thank you. And on that note, we've come to the end of our news review program.